Hi, I'm Ranger Chuck Arning with the National Park Service here in the John H. Chafee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And in fact, we are going through some really tough times. People out of work, Wall Street in shambles, unemployment lines growing, companies seeking government aid just to stay alive. Yep, these are tough times. But wait a minute. Let's go back maybe just 75 years and we'll find ourselves right in the center of our Great Depression. Some people referred to it as the worst hard times. Millions were out of work. Fierce winds were blowing crops across the American landscape, turning the land into desolation. People were totally in despair. Really tough times for a brand new young president. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a doer. He had a plan. He was going to take these two wasted resources, the people and the land, and bring them together. In March of 1933, FDR created the Civilian Conservation Corps as a means of addressing the acute conditions of despair and unemployment in the United States, and at the same time protect our vital national resources. So why don't you join me as we go back and revisit the Civilian Conservation Corps in our own times of economic distress and learn from these fantastic men the true meaning of the C's motto, "We can take it."
Yeah, that's good guys. The bad guys wouldn't stick. The ones that were dedicated would keep working. Other fellows, the foul-ups, they wouldn't stay. They'd take off, so we wound up with a good group.
We worked, I thought we worked so hard. We got up at 5:30 in the morning. Everything we did was by hand. And I was an axe man. And we chopped and chopped all day. And they kept us busy. It was the year of the 1938 hurricane. So there was so much down, flat. And we had to crawl through all of that. We could not step on the logs. And we were so tired, we never went to recreation hall. We went in the bunk. Like brothers, holy smoke, we helped make the beds because the beds had to be just right in the morning. You had, like everybody said, throw a quarter on it, and if it didn't bounce, they give you extra duty. Had to have square corners, so they'd all chip in, bing, 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 we made our beds.
In the legacy of the seas, I didn't have time to even think of it until about, 1970s and 80s. I traveled extensively all over the country and noticed the CCs from the Skyline Drive in Virginia to Oregon, Washington, and I noticed all the work they've done that's still intact.
Well, we're here with Ellen Arnold, who is actually the president and co-founder of the Friends of Upton State Forest. And we're here to talk to Ellen about the passion that she has brought to tell the story of the Civilian Conservation Corps here in Upton State Forest, because this is one of the original camps, SP-25. And Ellen, how did you get started on this wonderful story about the CCCs?
Well, for myself, it actually goes back a lot further than living in Upton. When I was a child, I grew up in New Hampshire, very near a CCC camp, and the park that they built, I played at as a child and learned to swim in the pond that they built. So it was very personal to me. And then I met Frank Evans when I met my husband, and Frank had been in the seas. And it was just something that was interesting to me through my life. And as you know, I worked with Upton Historical Society for quite a long time. But it just became something closer to me because my property is next to the state forest. And I've always been interested in the camp here. And when I realized that there was no longer any activity and it seemed to be abandoned, it became of a concern to me.
And you brought a lot of passion to this particular story because obviously from your background, there's a lot of personal connection to it. But even more importantly, this is one of the last really good sites in the state that talks about the seas.
It is, because here you can come, you have an intact campsite with a parade ground. You have 3 buildings. There are 3 of only 5 remaining actual camp buildings in Massachusetts where the enrollees actually lived while they were working. You can come into the site from the opening and just focus right up on the building and where the flagpole would have been. You can walk around and look at the cedar trees that are here, and the cedar trees were shrubs when the Seas were here. They planted them next to the buildings. So you can pretty much interpret the camp layout. We work with the 3rd grade, we bring them here, and it's exciting to be able to pass the story to young people. It's an ideal location to do that. It makes you realize how much time has gone by.
And I think the other thing that you have done so much here is to help us understand just how important the Seas were to the story of America's state parks and national parks. Because if you can go any place in this country, any state in the Union, the Seas were there building something.
That's correct. We owe them so much. In Massachusetts, anywhere you go today in Massachusetts, you can find a park that the Seas built. You can use a pond that they made built a dam. You can go fishing, you can go swimming, you can just picnic. They had picnic areas, some of which are still in use today. This land before the Seas was pretty much in crisis, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt realized that, and he knew that he had 2 crises. He had a crisis of the human population during the Depression, young men out of work, and he had a crisis of the land, because in building this country we used so many of the natural resources. There was a huge problem with flooding, with erosion, with forest fire, and so having the Seas work, it was actually rebuilding our country. They strung miles of telephone lines, they built bridges, they built dams, and they transformed this country in a way that I don't think any other program has. It was pretty much the 2nd largest story of the 20th century, and it was a positive story. World War II, we hear about, that was the largest story, the Greatest Generation, but the Greatest Generation, their positive story is the CCCs.
Now you've built, or you and many others have put together this wonderful organizations, Friends of Upton State Forest, to help tell the story and preserve the site. Could you tell a little bit about that organization?
Sure. Our mission is to preserve, enhance, and protect the natural and historic resources of Upton State Forest. And we feel that what we're doing is bringing together 2 people with different interests. We have people that primarily are interested in recreation. We have people who are primarily interested in history, but they're all working together. And we all recognize the value of having a place like this and to be able to share it. So we do programs with children. We've developed brochures. We provided content and pictures and turned it over to the 6th and 7th grade technology class to do a brochure for us. We do programs on the Civilian Conservation Corps, as well as bringing speakers to our meetings and doing programs on the natural resources, wildlife, and invasive species. We try to educate to all aspects of having a state forest in our backyard. The Friends actually raised money, and with the help of a private donor and with another organization, Bay State Trail Riders Association, that works closely with us. We raised money for 2 projects this year in a matching grant. And one of our projects was the flagpole. It's so nice to have a flagpole at Upton again. So we'll have it for events and occasions, and when the children come to visit, and hopefully someday it'll be a situation where we actually have a site here that can be enjoyed daily with staff that can put the flag up every day. But to me, it's a special significance to be able to have the flag flying at a place like this again. In fact, in 2005, after the Friends realized that the camp had basically been closed as far as actual use, and we realized the possibilities of what would happen to it if it wasn't preserved, we nominated the site and the buildings for the Preservation Mass list of 10 most endangered resources in Massachusetts, historic resources. And we were successful, and they agreed with us also that this site is of value for education and should be preserved.
And there's other things going to take place on this parade ground area to really enhance the feeling of use today. For example, I think over here we have a little picnic area that there are some plans for that, aren't there?
There are. We've had several Boy Scouts that have shown interest in projects at Upton State Forest to earn their Eagle status. One of them this summer has plans to, he's designing right now a picnic pavilion and getting the permits and funding necessary to actually build a picnic pavilion on that site. So it's exciting to me that almost within the location of where the former mess hall was, which is we're standing today at where the doorway would have been, that we're going to actually have a picnic pavilion, very much in the style of the CCC, that people can come and enjoy today.
And you had how many men here?
About 200 or 210 at a time, and then every 6 months the enrollments ended and some of them left and some of them stayed. But we have no actual count of over the period the camp was open how many men were here, but about 200 to 210 at a time.
Many states took this challenge very seriously, and throughout our nation, most of the national parks and certainly many of the national parks are a direct result of the involvement of these young men, often referred to as boys, who are involved with the seas, who work very hard in difficult locations to conserve these valuable resources. At this commemorative poster here, put out by the Department of Conservation and Resource here in Massachusetts, it's clear that conservation ethic is an important part of the legacy the seas have given to the state even today. The best way to understand just about the value of the Conservation Corps here in Massachusetts is head up to the west part of state, near Mount Greylock, and meet with Visitor Services Supervisor Alec Gilman and understand the real value of the Civilian Conservation Corps here in Massachusetts. We're fortunate to be up here in Pittsfield, Massachusetts at the West Regional Headquarters for Department of Conservation and Recreation and talking to Alec Gilman, who's the Supervisor of Visitor Services. But we're talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps. And Alec, for a lot of people, a time of breadlines and high unemployment and a terrible time for this country, the seas had a tremendous impact on the state park system. Here in Massachusetts, what kind of impact was that?
Well, the seas, when they came in, the state park system really was in its infancy. So what the Civilian Conservation Corps program enabled the state to do was develop its entire state park system, expand upon it, from campgrounds to day use areas, swimming and picnicking, to trails, roads, infrastructure, and also its forestry, and most importantly, its forestry program. And that included not only the silviculture aspect, but also fire control and prevention. So the seas really created what is today the modern agency that we all know. So
And love. I mean, all of us have been to the
absolutely.
state ponds and the hike on the trails in winter and everything.
Yeah.
So the legacy is really a strong one here because this is what they did and this is what we play in today.
Yes. When the Sea program started, there was a enrollment quota that was set up. It was about 6,500 men, the first to be in the camps by July. So they could sign up if they were, their family was on the dole, welfare. They could go through their local welfare board, or they could go to a sea enrollment office in either Worcester, Springfield, or the South Boston Army base. And they filled that quota in the first few months of the program, from April to July. And they continued to fill subsequent quotas. They didn't know if the program was going to go beyond October, really, when the first 6 months was up. So they were living in tents. When they went out to these forests, they were actually cutting out their campgrounds in addition to doing their work. Road building, forestry, recreation, development. They were actually carving out their camps and setting up these tent cities, pretty much, to live in for those first few months. So it was pretty rigorous for those first enrollees coming into the program. And lo and behold, when they found out that they were getting funding beyond into the winter, they not only had to come up with a different program, what were they going to do in the winter besides what they had been, normally doing in the summertime. So that was more probably forestry, timber stand improvement, and also control for insects. They had to build their tar paper cities. And these were, this was probably the largest lumber order in Massachusetts. It was something like 5 billion linear square feet they had of wood they had to get.
Holy cow.
That's a lot of wood.
That is a lot of wood.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to note that not only were there 100,000 men in Massachusetts enrolled in the Seas, there were also 48,000 other Massachusetts men in other camps in New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon, to name a few. But so a lot of Massachusetts men actually did go out west. Some of them stayed, and a bunch of them came back.
Now, some of these guys were, came from the cities of New England.
Yes.
being in a rural, distant countryside must have been a huge culture shock.
Yeah, it was a new experience for a lot of guys, especially those who hadn't had the experience of scouting. Those that did have scouting experience really benefited from it. But it sort of added to the misery if you weren't used to it. In fact, there were a few instances where there was a refusal to work. And if you refused to work, well, you had an option. You could either start working or you could be sent home.
Troublemakers,
Yeah.
they had extra duty, and they'd work in the kitchen for maybe a week at a time, or work in the cesspool. They give them oddball jobs, and sooner or later they went over the hill.
So it was essentially a dishonorable discharge. They were very rigorous about the discipline in the camps. So they took care of you, the military took care of you when you were in the camps. And every day when they turned you out for work, they gave you over to either the National Park Service or the U.S. Forest Service to do the work projects. And when they came home at night, the Army took you over again.
So very heavily military model of what's the camp's functioned on.
Just for discipline's sake. It was only militaristic in that the Army was there to supervise the camps. Guns were not allowed in camps at all. They were forbidden. Drinking was not allowed in camp. So there was very strict control over, what you could do and couldn't do. But they saw to it that you also had lots of recreational opportunities and later on learning opportunities in these camps. So it was really a really wide breadth of experiences that camp life offered these guys.
They had a baseball team, but well, it had to be a real good sport to play baseball.
And I think many times we forget just how devastating the Great Depression was on America across the board.
I tried to buy a job. I couldn't even buy it. Depression was something. You couldn't, you get out of school and you're just back where you started. But I just get about 16, 17, you're kind of looking forward to get out and going to work, but it didn't work out, so I planned on the seas.
One of the other things that I want to talk a little bit about had to do with food. I mean, this was significant. They got 3 squares a day.
Yes.
And you came up with a statistic about how much weight gain the average guy had?
It was about 11 pounds in the first 3 months, something like that.
Wow.
But a lot of food, stuff that they had never, couldn't eat at home. Either they couldn't afford it, or it was just poor nutrition. But the nutritional aspect in the sea camp was very, very strictly monitored. How many calories per day these guys were getting. And it came down to menus, developing these menus. And they might rotate, or they might, be creative. In some camps, they didn't get fed so well. I mean, it was really dependent upon the cook's ability. So they really had to have trained cooks in order to have a good meal.
He became a second-class cook. That was rather just by coincidence. He recalls leaving his house in Ludlow, going to Springfield to the railroad station, winding up in Fort Devens, staying there approximately a week for orientation, getting a uniform, finding out what life was going to be like now, and then coming out here to this camp. And he said all the new enrollees were lined up on the green. And he happened to be near the end of the line. He said there were 6 or 8 of them at the end, and the rest of the line stretching out. And the sergeant barked out to those at the end to leave and to follow someone else. And they were a little frightened at first, wondering, why were they being singled out? And the answer was they were going to the kitchen area. And so that's how he became the cook. As a result, he was sent to Fort Adams in Rhode Island for training. And he came back, and as second-class cook, he received a better pay, $6 additional that he could keep.
And they had to send $25 out of the $30 back
That's
home.
right. That's right. Yeah, $25 home. Some guys, scoffed at that. What do I get $5. What am I gonna, what can I do? They could do a lot with $5, and there's a lot of good stories about how they spent that $5.
I can imagine.
But that, back then, soda was 5 cents. The movies 10 cents. You could get a lot of mileage on that $5. That was part of the C program, to see that local businesses benefited from these camps coming in. A lot of people were hesitant. Oh, we don't want a C camp. They'll be drinking and all sorts of carousing, and we don't want that. But what they didn't realize was, once they were there, the C's actually were very courteous. I mean, they were again under military, the disciplinary aspect. So they were very respectful of the community. There were a few wild guys, not to say that they weren't, were all,
Right.
on the level, but the local businesses were supplying a lot of these sea camps with with material, but also the local men, local experienced men that were our LEMs, were brought into the camp to do specific work projects and/or build the camps or any kind of renovation. So local population really was invested. And then sometimes they came in for a show on the weekends, either a movie or a performance that the C enrollees were putting on. So it was really, they were really well tied. Especially during the floods of 1936 in March 1936 and the hurricane of 1938 in September. The devastation that followed those events, those natural disasters, the C's were right there to either sandbag or keep communication and transportation lines open, rescue people, clean up after it. They were pretty much the support system after these natural disasters. This was to get the economy rolling, get people back to work. So at the end of their term, either an enrollee or a LEM, they would find work somewhere else in the field.
I had a high mechanical aptitude, so they pushed me on heavy equipment, and I signed up for 2 years and a half, and ended up with the superintendent saying, go out and earn some money in 1941. And so he shipped me to Quonset Point, so I run bulldozers, road graders, and that stuff. And I stuck to that heavy equipment for 42 years.
The average guy was about 5'8", was about 150 pounds. First Army Corps area, which was all of New England. There was mixed enrollment. You had African Americans and Caucasians, a lot of Italians and Portuguese descent, a mixed crowd in the New England camps. So as they were, more or less integrated, it was accepted, at least here in New England. In other parts of the country, it tended to be either segregated camps or just, they would have what they call colored camps. They would have veteran camps, camps for veterans of World War I and other wars. So these guys were 40 years or older, in their 30s or older actually, or the junior enrollee camps. So that's sort of the division of the camps. But in New England, you just had your junior enrollees and your veteran camps.
African Americans were enrolled in the C's, taking advantage of this work opportunity just like many other Americans. However, there was a difference. It was the time of Jim Crow, a series of rigid segregationist laws that created and maintained a divided society, predominantly throughout the South and in border states, but not just there. While economic distress hit the African American worker in higher numbers, they were limited to only 10% enrollment in the C's based on their population. Racist practices were rampant, outright discrimination common, hostility from the local communities routine. While there was a provision within the law that created the C's outlawing discrimination, Robert Fechner, the director of the Emergency Conservation Board, an outright segregationist, in a letter to Thomas Griffin, chairman of the California branch of the NAACP, stated that segregation was not discrimination. However, not all states complied. Particularly here in New England, there is much evidence to suggest that this directive was ignored. It was certainly true here at Camp SP-25 in Upton, Massachusetts, where African Americans were clearly part of the Union. From a historical perspective, it is interesting to note that just about 30 years later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting, among many things, discrimination in public places. While it was a long and painful path, it's certainly possible that units like the C's camp here at Upton helped break through the door of segregation.
So this was really a model for a successful government program that could be integrated. Implementing this program again on the scale that the federal government did at that time, it really took the sort of the collaboration of multiple agencies. The only agency that really dragged its feet in making the Civilian Conservation Corps happen was the War Department. Actually, the War Department during the Great Depression was minuscule compared to before or after that period. So they really felt, you know, they were dragging their feet and they had the ability to make this program happen. But you also, again, had the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, you had the Labor Department, and all these agencies came together. The president said, make this happen, make this happen. So if it wasn't for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this program would never have happened. So by his initiative, the War Department got involved and it happened. And to make that happen today, it really comes down to the initiative of perhaps the executive branch. But it also comes down to people. Mm-hmm. You and I and our viewers to say, you know, this program did something for our environment, which is good for us. You know, let's make this happen again.
Well, this has been Ranger Chuck Arning with the National Park Service here in the John H. Chafee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And it's clear that the warmth of summer has left us, whereas we're surrounded by snow and winter's cold at Camp SP-25 here in Upton State Forest. But the memories, they are still here. As we've learned from our conversation with these men, the C's changed their lives, put them on the path to success, kept them out of trouble, turned boys into men, and at the same time created this infrastructure that created our national parks and our many great state parks. The work was hard, the sacrifice was great, but in the end, they were able to bring us out of the Great Depression. So we have much to thank them. And their motto, "We can take it," is something that today we can still take heed to. And before we go, we need to thank the Friends of Upton State Forest. Through their hard work and preservation, it was them that allowed these stories to be preserved and for them to go into our memory bank. So next time, hope to see you in the valley.
I have to work most every day. $5 a month is my pay. I'm just wasting my life away. Oh, I joined the CCC.